Circle of Hope Network, doing life and being church together.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Hope you've had a good lunch. Yes, I'll take that as a yes. Fabulous. For those of you who've not met me before, my name is Dr. Chidi. I come from England. I think sometimes when I do these sorts of things, people, well, what sort of a doctor are you? Really, what sort of a doctor are you? Well, I trained as a surgeon, first of all. I was at Cambridge University and I trained as a surgeon. I actually came out to the United States and spent some time working with Dr. Ben Carson. I was thinking about doing neurosurgery at the time. He put me off. I then went back and I became an orthopedic surgeon back in England. But I've always really wanted to help people reverse disease. I've always known we've had the ability. From a child, I used to read all these books from Ellen White, Ministry of Healing, Medical Ministry. And so I thought there's something more that we can do. So I then retrained to be a general practitioner. Then I came out to the States again, trained in lifestyle medicine, and haven't looked back. Yes, amen. Thank you very much. So this week we've been looking at this Life Colors series. Each color represents a different disease. We're really getting to the end of the week. And so today we're going to look at this gray color, gray for a specific reason, because it is talking about depression and anxiety. I'll put a bit of stress in there as well. But what I would say is if you examine the known universe, you can go from one end to the other and you will never find anything as complicated as the human brain. There is nothing put together quite so complicated as the human brain. The human brain has about 100 billion nerve cells. Each of those nerve cells has at least 1,000 connections. Many of them have about 10,000 connections. So we're looking at minimum 100 trillion connections between all of those nerve cells in the brain. That's, we can't really imagine that number. Nobody's got that amount in their bank yet, have they? If they have, just lend me a bit. I'd appreciate it. But to try to imagine it, if you think about the Amazon rainforest, many people consider that the lungs of the earth. It provides much of the oxygen for the whole entire planet. The Amazon rainforest it's a huge and vast area. It has loads of trees in it. If you were to count all of the trees in the Amazon rainforest and then count every single leaf on every single tree, you still would not be at the number of connections we have in our brain. It is absolutely vast. And it's vast not only numerically, but in its power. The brain does about 50,000 trillion operations every second. 50,000 trillion operations every second. Even when you're just sitting down watching the TV, it's working. Some of the best supercomputers on Earth, these are the computers that predict the weather. These are vast. The biggest computers we have don't even get to 0.01% of the capacity of our brain. It is absolutely fabulous. 1 quadrillion bytes. More than one. I can't even come to that figure. I don't even know what that really means. When it works, we can do stupendous things. People like Einstein have come up with theories of relativity, all the things that are going on in the known universe. When we collectively work together, we can produce things like the International Space Station, still the most expensive, complicated building we've ever produced on Earth, but I guess it's above Earth. But sometimes the brain doesn't work as well as we want it to. When people get into this place of feeling low, feeling depressed, the brain is not working at its optimum. It is still working very well. in many regions, but there's just a cloud that hangs over us. And many of us have suffered with these sort of symptoms. Often in the West, we say 1/4 of the general population will experience some kind of depression in their life. But the evidence tells us that pretty much everyone at some point in your life will go through some sort of depression. It is not just certain types of people, it's all of us. And it can be triggered for many different reasons. But this is what the definition of depression is: a mental condition characterized by feelings of severe despondency and dejection, typically also with feelings of inadequacy, guilt, often accompanied by lack of energy, disturbance of appetite, and sleep. Many years ago, I think back in the 1950s, they came up with this idea that depression is anger turned inwards, and anger is depression turned outwards. In fact, they tried to prove this theory by getting a group of depressed people. They said, well, depression is anger turned inwards on the person. So, okay, let's get this group of people who are depressed, and we're going to get them to dig a square ditch in the garden. This was in a sanitarium. So these depressed people were out digging a ditch in the garden. They came back and said, okay, we finished the ditch. The psychiatrist would say, well, the ditch isn't quite straight enough. Could you just make it straight? They'd go back. They'd start digging the ditch again. They come back, 4 or 5 attempts, and there's always something wrong with the ditch. At that point, the anger was no longer turned inwards on the individual. It was turned outwards to the psychiatrist. And they thought this would heal people from depression. I guess you know that it didn't work. It didn't work. But actually, it's still a nice idea and saying that depression is like something against oneself. It's looking inwards. Depression obviously affects the brain. That's where the seat of it happens. If you get a bit closer in the brain, we've said that you have about 100 billion cells and they've all got these connections. Let me show you a connection. This is called, so you have one nerve going on to another. So this is the end of one nerve, and it goes on to the beginning of another nerve. And this gap is called the synapse, okay? Because nerves are not actually connected together. There was a break in between. And what tends to happen is that these chemicals here, when the electrical impulse gets to the end of the nerve, these bags of chemicals reach the surface and explode and release these little neurotransmitter chemicals that start the process again on the other side. Now, these neurotransmitters in the middle here is where most of the pharmaceutical companies like to operate on, right? So you've heard of these drugs like Prozac. You've heard of Prozac? Yeah, so Prozac is one of the most common antidepressant drugs. What Prozac does is stop this neurotransmitter from being taken back up into the nerve. So you get lots of this neurotransmitter in the space, and they believe that if you have lots of this chemical, it's usually dopamine or serotonin there, you feel better. This is based on a theory that depression is a low amount of neurotransmitter in the brain. You may have heard about that. But let me tell you, this theory has never been proved. It's never been proved. You can look it up. In fact, much of the research tells us that this is not the reason why we get depressed. It's not just a random lowering of neurotransmitter in the brain. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. And I guess since we're talking about drugs, why don't we mention the good old drugs, cannabis and ecstasy. You have them over here? Some of you, yeah? You have cannabis in Canada, do you? I thought they just legalized it here. All right, so we call it the soft drugs. That's what we tend to say. You know, cannabis is the soft drugs. But cannabis has never been a soft drug. Never been a soft drug. Before I did medicine, I did pharmacology and physiology at King's College. And we did a lot on drugs. And I remember one lecture, it was talking about schizophrenia. and they said, well, in order to test drugs on rats, we have to make these rats schizophrenic. Then we give them the drugs. If they work, then we start to use them on monkeys and use them on humans. I was too embarrassed to ask the question, but at the end, I said, how'd you get a schizophrenic rat? You know, I can't imagine anything worse than having a schizophrenic rat in my house. So I just want to make sure there's nothing I'm doing to make rats schizophrenic around me. He said, well, look, if you want to make a rat schizophrenic, you just fill them with cannabis. The more cannabis you give a rat, they become schizophrenic. Then we test drugs that relieve the schizophrenia, and then we start to use it on monkeys and humans. Cannabis has been known to cause schizophrenia right from the outset. Starts with a little bit of paranoia and anxiety, leads all the way to schizophrenia. It doesn't matter if it's the strong stuff they call skunk or the weak stuff, it causes schizophrenia, paranoia, anxiety, and depression. Ecstasy causes the exact opposite of what its name suggests. So it may give you a few moments of ecstasy, but it leaves you as depressed. So never should we consider these drugs as soft drugs. They are hard drugs. They are drugs to keep us, we need to keep away from those drugs. But let's just go back to depression. I like to start with a few simple things. Depression mind keeping. You know, some people like to look at their house and say we have housekeeping. Well, I think about depression mind keeping. Some of the things you can do to make the environment in your brain less susceptible to depression. So here are 12 things to keep you happy, I guess. At the beginning, you can see the banana. The banana feeds into that theory of, well, if you have lots of serotonin in your system, you won't be so depressed. Most monkeys are not that depressed, so I guess bananas work. Exercise is very important. Greens are fabulous. Just smiling, being with people, having hugs, eating nuts, drinking enough water. All of these things create an environment in your brain which makes you less conducive to depression. These are just the physical basics. It doesn't mean that you can never be depressed if you do all these things, but these are just the physical basics to mean that your brain is at optimal level. But to be clear, there are real emotional causes for depression. Real emotional causes for depression. And we tend to categorize them into 4 groups. We call them the 4 Ds. The biggest triggers are debt or financial worries, divorce or relationship problems, disease or addictions, or the death of a loved one. These things can trigger us into depression. Whenever these things happen, we're never going to be happy with them anyway, but for some of us, that sadness can be longer lasting. So if these are some of the triggers, there are some simple things we can do to reduce the risk of it spiraling into depression. First thing to do is to get some practical help. You know, with all of these things, there are people who can help us, whether it's debt or relationship problems or health problems. Talk to somebody, share it. The more that we keep it in and keep it to ourselves, the worse it grows. You know, depression is like mushrooms. They grow in the darkness. So if you don't share and you're not able to talk about it, it is bound to get worse. And we find many people who come to the place where they want to take their own lives, they do it because they've never really shared what's going on in their heart. They've been embarrassed or ashamed, or they feel guilty about it. And what tends to happen with depression is that we spiral into this circle of self-thought, where we constantly end up thinking about ourselves. This is one of the things that keeps us in a depressed state. We're thinking about how hurt we are, how we've got no future, how much pain we're going through. Those thoughts keep running round in our head, and it just sends us into this spiral of depression. The question I always get asked, like most illnesses, well, you know, why do we get this? Why do some people get depression and other people don't? Is it in the genes? Now, some of you may have read that there is some genetic link in depression as it runs in families. You know, when I look at the evidence for it, it doesn't seem to be that strong. So, for example, if you say if your mother has depression, you have a higher risk of getting depressed yourself. Well, think about it. If you're a child raised in a home where your mother is depressed, and when you're looking at somebody for love and happiness, they have a blank expression, you're more likely to develop those traits yourself. So we've never yet come across the gene for depression. There may be a genetic link. I mean, it's debatable. But I'm saying, even if it is genetic, there are things that we know can lead to depression. So rather than the genes, there is this thing called adverse childhood experiences. Maybe you've heard of them. We call them ACEs. So if you've had a severe trauma in your childhood, and trauma could mean, your parents split up, or you were abused, or you have an alcoholic family member, any one of those we call an adverse childhood experience, and they are linked to our health. They're all linked to our health. Have a look at this. This is one study that was done from 17,000 people, and it showed that if you have three ACEs or more, your risk of lung disease goes up 400%. Why should that be? Why should lung disease be linked to a childhood trauma? Any ideas? Sorry? Tension? A lot of tension. So lung disease there? Lung disease? Okay, the main reason is, look, it is linked to stress. It is linked to stress, actually. So look, you go through this trauma, you are stressed. How do you relieve your stress? One way to relieve it is to smoke. So one way to relieve it is smoking, and if you smoke, it increases your risk of lung disease. Your risk of depression goes up 500%, suicide over 1,000, obesity 1,000. So even though we spend millions of pounds and dollars looking for the gene for depression, we have some pretty strong answers as to why we get depressed. Why do some people get it and other people don't? Sometimes we look at people and we say, we make a judgment on them. Oh, this person's overweight, this person's depressed. I would never be like that. But you don't know what they've been through. You don't know their background. If you had the same background, would you be in the same place? Maybe you would be worse. Our childhood experiences are vital. There's this poem, if a child lives with criticism, they learn to condemn. If they live with hostility, they learn to fight. If they live with ridicule, they learn to be shy. If they live with shame, they learn to feel guilty. The converse is true. If they live with love, they learn to be loving. They live with acceptance, they learn to be accepting. So our childhood has a big impact on where we are today and how we respond to adverse experiences. So how do we actually break the cycle? How do we break that cycle that's spiraling out into depression? So this was a picture taken of me when I used to take good pictures. I'm glad you're laughing. This is me and my mother. So I was born in London, but I was raised in a place called Brighton. This is in the south part of England, just by the sea. And I was raised in a foster home. So my parents put me in this foster home because this was quite common in those days. By the way, the reason why it's black and white is not because I'm so old. It's just that my dad took black and white pictures, okay? Just in case you were thinking of that. So I was in a foster home, a very loving foster home, a lovely white family, very poor but very loving, I thought. But, they weren't the world's best parents, because they let me do whatever I wanted to do. Because I remember being 3 years old, being out on the streets maybe at midnight, and I'd come in and my parents would just say, okay, have you eaten? Yes, okay, go to bed. I mean, there was no really rules or boundaries. Maybe that explains why I am the way I am today. I don't know. But we rarely had a bath in those days. My parents came back one day and they saw the state I was in, and they said, okay, we're gonna move you somewhere else. And they moved me somewhere else. They took me to a place called Portsmouth. And this is like going from the frying pan into the fire, because the person who was looking after me in Portsmouth must have been trained by the Nazis. I don't say that lightly. I mean, she had all sorts of tortures for young children. She looked like an innocent woman, but she was terrible. So I had a terrible few months there. And I remember when I left, because she couldn't cope with me, she said I was too much to cope with. So when I left, and I told my parents, things weren't so good, my mother said, you know what you're going to have to do? I said, what? You're going to have to forgive this woman. I'm a kid. I didn't even know what forgiveness meant. But I grew up, I became a teenager, and my mother said, well, it's about time you go and visit this woman again and forgive her. So I remember getting on the train, going down there. I was there with my brother. And I said, well, how am I going to forgive this person? She's done terrible, terrible things to me. I remember one day, I can't even remember what I did, but I was about 4 years old at the time. She said, right, I want you to stand on a crate in the shed outside. Right, okay. And if you come off the crate, I'm going to make you stand there for another hour. So I had to stand on that crate for 24 hours, night, all the way through the night. On your own. No, there's no sleep. Yeah, can you imagine a 4-year-old child? That's just some of the things I can tell you about. That's one of the milder things that she did. So here am I thinking, how am I going to forgive this person? I knocked on her door. When I saw her, a lot of the bitterness just melted away. And I'll tell you why it melted away. Because I looked at her, and she was so crippled with arthritis. She had lost pretty much all of her fingers. It was so bad. She couldn't walk properly. I then had this feeling of sorrow. I was sorry just looking at her. And what that did for me, it didn't allow me to live my life with bitterness towards her. It actually freed me from bitterness towards this person. Being able to forgive allowed me to live my childhood and adult life without looking back with that bitterness. This is one of the strongest and most powerful things we can do to break that cycle. Learning how to heal from past experiences, whether you had a difficult childhood, a difficult relationship, whatever. By learning how to forgive, that's the only way we can be free. We're going to show this video, and then I'll come back to you. So forgiveness is really one of the most powerful ways to break that cycle. I mean, I think I've spoken about forgiveness probably every day of this week. because really it is at the heart of all of these diseases. If you know that stress makes all of these diseases worse, one of the ways to eliminate stress is to learn to forgive. It's the way that we can get rid of this dis-ease. You're not at ease. So let's go a little bit further. And here's some of my, I would say, tips. How do you get to this place? How do you get to this place? Well, I like to say we have to learn to walk forwards and not backwards. I mean, most people, when they're walking down the street, they walk forwards. Very few people walk backwards down the road. And what I'm really saying is what we have to do is learn to let go. Learn to let go. I just want to see, has anybody ever caught a monkey in the wild? Ever caught a chimpanzee? No? Don't have chimpanzees up here no? Okay, well look, let me give you some advice just in case you find yourself in the jungle and you need to catch a chimpanzee. I'm going to give you tips on how to do it. You see, chimpanzees are very intelligent beings. And if you want to catch a chimpanzee, you just have to outwit them. The best thing to do is to build a box, a crate, fill it with all the things that monkeys like to eat, bananas and nuts. You seal that crate, and you just make a little hole in the side so that the monkey can look inside and see what's there, and then you just wait. So the monkey will come along, it will look inside, it will grab hold of the banana, but now that it's made a fist, its hand is too big to get out. It will never occur to the chimpanzee, as intelligent as it is, to let go of the banana. Just won't do it. All you then have to do is throw a net over it. It will scream its head off, but it will never let go of the banana. It is trapped because it can't let go of the banana. That is exactly how we are when we look back on the things that have hurt us. We hold on to it. We hold on to the bitterness. We're trapped. The enemy has us now trapped because we'll never let go. I can't forgive that person. By not forgiving, you're trapping yourself. And what then happens is that you are constantly walking backwards, looking back at what happened in the past. And if you're looking back, you can never see what God has for you in the future. And God has so much for all of us in our future. Every single one of us. But we'll never see it if we're always looking back at the past. We have to learn to let go. Here's something that happened to me. The Bible says, whatever you sow, so shall you reap. That's why I say we have to let the seed lead. Most of us want peace in our life. We want happiness, joy, love. Well, in order to have these things, you have to start sowing those seeds. They don't just happen. You have to sow the seeds first. And I remember when I was training as a GP, there was a gentleman who would come into my office every Thursday morning, and he would sit there and say, "Doctor, I'm depressed." And he would just sit there. Everything I tried to say to him, he'd just say, "Doctor, I'm just depressed." And then one day I said to him, "Well, how would you describe your depression?" And he said, "Well, if my life was a board game," have you heard of Snakes and Ladders? So he said, if my life was a board game, instead of snakes and ladders, it would be snakes and snakes. And I did exactly what you did. I started laughing. And when you're in those positions where you're not supposed to laugh, you laugh even more. So I started laughing, and he was just there with his straight face. And as I looked at his straight face, I started laughing even more. 5 minutes in, I'm crying with laughter. I can't sit up straight. And he's just sat there looking at me. After 10 minutes, I composed myself. And I said, "Yeah, I'm sorry. It was just such a..." He said, "Don't worry about that, doctor. Seeing you laugh like that, it's the first time I've been of use to anybody in the last 2 years. Making me laugh was the first time he was of use to anybody It made him feel better because he was useful. We talk about how to break this cycle of self-thought. Well, here's one thing you can do. Just do something simple for somebody else. It takes your mind off of yourself. Now you might say, well, when I'm depressed, I don't really want to do it. Just do it and see what happens. One of the problems of depression is that we constantly look in at ourselves. By just doing something simple for somebody else, it can break that cycle. Here's something else that we need to do. James 5, verse 16 says, confess your sins one to another that you may be healed. Confess your sins one to another that you may be healed. Interestingly, it doesn't say confess your sins one to another that you may be forgiven. I don't need to confess to you to be forgiven. But if I want to be healed from whatever's bothering me, whether it's an addiction or whatever, if I want to be healed, I need to find somebody who I can trust and I can talk to. Find a human being that I can trust, talk to, and share all of my faults, because none of us are perfect, right? Everybody's perfect up here these days. None of us are perfect. We've all got problems. And if we're able to share them, it doesn't build up into us as guilt. And if the guilt doesn't build up, we're less likely then to fall into depression. When we share, when we're together, we have a video coming up, when we're together, we can accomplish so much more than when we're on our own. Sometimes we think things are impossible on our own, but together we can do things that we couldn't even believe. It's much better together. Don't run alone. None of us need to run alone. All of us, there is somebody there to help all of us. We just have to look. And look, this idea of sharing your faults, look, I can talk to you because we're from the church. This is where churches should be coming into their own. You know, we all go to church and we look fantastic and we say Happy Sabbath and we leave still feeling as broken as when we came. Part of that is because we don't really trust each other enough to share my real problems. You know, hello, how are you? By the time you open your mouth, the person's already moved on. We need to start making proper connections in the church. Otherwise, we're going to have churches filled with broken people. And when the world comes in, they can see that we're broken. You can't hide it. You know, they see the bitterness. They see the anger. Oh, what's this persistent fly? You see, trying to make me bitter now. You know? So they can see all the bitterness and anger. So we have to learn to start making these proper connections with each other. Superficial church doesn't do it. That was never what God intended. We are supposed to be sharing. You look in the book of Acts. The book of Acts talks about when the church really grew, people were sharing everything, eating together, sharing together. Not just looking like we are almost perfect when we come to church. There's no problem with my life, with my health, with my marriage, with, you know, we need to start sharing our faults. That way we can avoid some of these depressions. Here's something else we need to do. Embrace the pain. Anybody want to embrace pain? No. Good. Well, I say embrace pain because when you embrace a little pain, it often helps us avoid a much bigger pain down the line. What do I mean by that? Well, I used to work in the emergency room, as I've told you. And there was one day, see, back in England, you know, maybe 10 or so years ago, you could wait in the emergency room for about 10 hours to see a doctor. And there was one guy who came in, big guy, tattoos all over his body, all up his face. And he sat and waited for 10 hours to see a doctor. Eventually, I drew the short straw and I picked his name. And I said, well, what can I do for you? He said, Doctor, I've got a splinter in my finger. I wonder if you can get rid of it for me. I said, yes, of course. I'm going to take you into the room next door. I'm going to anesthetize your finger, and then I'm going to remove the splinter. He said, anesthetize? What do you mean anesthetize? Well, I just have to inject your finger a few times so that it goes numb, then I can remove the splinter. Otherwise, it will be too painful. He thought about it. He said, well, I don't really like needles. He's got tattoos all over him. I don't know how he got. I don't really like needles, doctor. Well, I said, well, you know what? That's the only way I can do it. If you want it to be removed, you're going to have a few injections in your finger. So he thought about it a little bit more and he said, it's okay, doctor, I'm going to go home. Right? This was 2 o'clock in the morning. He left. 2 days later, he came back. I knew he had come back into the department because he screamed the place down. A little girl just brushed past his finger, which was now the size of his hand. It had blown up. And it was so painful, he screamed the place down. So this was now bigger than what we could do in ER. We had to send him to theatre. He had to stay for several days in hospital to allow all the pus and the blood to drain out of that finger. So because he didn't want to experience a little pain, he had much more pain down the line. Now, some of us are exactly like that. We don't want to experience a little bit of pain. You don't want people to tell us about ourselves. We even say this thing, don't go there. But because we don't want to experience that little bit of pain of sorting out our problems, we end up with more pain down the line. Until one day, somebody just steps on your foot in church and you just explode. Yeah, not because somebody stepped on your foot, but because you haven't dealt with the issues inside. That's what we have to learn to do. Don't avoid pain. Look, speaking of pain, I go to marriage counseling most years, right? Marriage counseling most years. And when I'm on my way to marriage counseling with my wife, I'm thinking to myself, I don't even know why I'm going to marriage counseling. Everything's fine, you know? As soon as we sit down, my wife brings out this long list of problems. It's as though she's been saving them up all year. And as we're going through them, I have to say, it's a little bit painful. It's a little bit painful. But actually, after the next few sessions, when we've dealt with some of these problems, we find out that the relationship is much better at the end of it than at the beginning. So I don't avoid the small pain of embarrassment and guilt and hurt feelings. I go through that so that we can have a nicer experience, a nicer place in the future. Oh, great, we've got another preacher here. So you're enjoying this so much. Thank you, I appreciate that. Right, so let's embrace the small amount of pain, so that we can avoid the big amount of pain. In fact, what we know about depression is that often it's a build-up. So somebody said something to you a few years ago, instead of addressing it, you said, I don't want to deal with that, I'll just let that go. But you don't actually let that go, it's still in your heart. Somebody else says something else to you, it builds up until you break. And either you explode or you go into yourself and become depressed. So it's important that we don't avoid those uncomfortable moments. We don't have to be rude. We can just say, look, what you said actually hurt me. This is how I feel about it. These are things that we have to do to relieve ourselves from the pain. Look, I'm coming to the end. So I would say, when it comes to health, it has a lot to do with how we look. I don't mean how we appear, but I mean how we look. And what I mean by that is we need to look back with forgiveness. We need to look forward with hope. Look down with compassion. There's always somebody who needs your help. And never forget to look up with gratitude. By being grateful, by being thankful for everything we have each and every day. Sometimes even when things are going bad, there are many things we can be thankful for. This is an antidote to depression. Okay, any questions? Any questions? Oh, that's good. No questions. I go home early today. As soon as I say no questions, people put their hands up. What? That's a reflex.
I have a question. It's back a couple of days. You said that you shouldn't have wheat
Yes.
if you have an autoimmune disease.
Yes.
Now, what about spelt and rye and
Yeah, okay.
is that?
So that's, I was saying a few days ago that when you're talking about autoimmune, and sadly we didn't get to fit in a session on autoimmunity. Autoimmunity is obviously the yellow section on the DVD. So you're right, wheat stimulates our autoimmune system. Milk does the same thing. Spelt, it has about a 10% crossover of proteins. So for some of us, it can still cause an autoimmune problem. Rye is okay. Rye is absolutely okay. So you need to find alternatives to wheat. I would also try and find an alternative to spelt, so rye and other things are useful to alleviate autoimmune. Yes? Oh.
So I find that my biggest issue when it comes to depression, anxiety, those types of mental health issues is that, like me, myself, I've never dealt with them.
Yes.
But I work with young people and I work with other people and I always come across people who do deal with them, and I feel that I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know how to help. I don't know what to say because I don't quite fully understand what they're going through because I've never experienced it myself.
Yes.
And even sometimes when they talk to me about it, I still don't fully understand where they're coming, because they'll be like, oh, I don't feel any hope. And I'm like, not feel hope, right?
Yeah.
So what is something that someone who has a friend or family member that is close to them that's suffering with these mental health issues, what could we do? Like how do we go about helping them, I guess?
Right. So the first thing you can do is, which is what you're doing. First of all, you can just listen to them. That's great. But also put them on to somebody who can help. Even if the first port of call is your family physician. Because many of these issues, and I think it's probably the same here in Canada, if you have some kind of a mental health issue, they should be able to refer you to somebody just to have some talking therapy. Often we call it cognitive behavioral therapy. And what that's doing is enabling you to rethink why you think the way you do. Because it's often just the way we think that holds us captive. Sometimes we have thoughts that we've grown up with as a child, and we still have them. So in order to relieve that, we have cognitive behavioral therapy. So put them in contact with somebody who can help. It's always better if you can, because if you really want to get to the heart of the problem, it's always better if you can direct them to somebody who knows a bit more, not just about the medicine, not just about the physical, but also about the emotional and the spiritual. Because that is really at the heart of it. Who's next? Yes.
My oldest daughter suffers from severe depression. And she started out as a child that was born double breech. And she had her own first child and ended up being blind and bloodshot eyes because of that. But she's had quite a terrible life being whim banged. You know what that is? Whim banged.
No, I don't know what it is. But she's had a difficult life. Yes.
It was sexually abused.
Right.
Very brutally. And she has a wonderful husband, but she takes an awful lot of drugs and for her depression, etc. And they just kept adding up. And then she found out about cannabis, and they introduced her to that, and she has reduced maybe 4 to 6 different medication. She had a suitcase, little suitcase, 4x6 plus whatever. And she, with this cannabis, I see what you say is results of cannabis. She gets more depressed. She really is reacting to it, even though they're removing the need for the other drugs.
Yes. That's the issue.
So what do you suggest?
What do you do? Yes.
For
so
that.
This is a difficult thing, and I have to be quite clear on this, because the facts tell us this. The facts tell us this, and the evidence tells us. There's lots of studies. Harvard have done loads of studies on antidepressant medication. Even though it's debatable whether they do any good, all right, and I mean that, whether they do any good, just to come off them causes even more damage. So it's difficult. You're in a really catch-22 situation. What we recommend is, if you're getting some cognitive behavioral therapy, you've got some talking therapy going, and support, strong support, probably more than most families can give. So you need really acute support. You can then start to very slowly come off the medication, very slowly. Because one of the side effects, actually, of some of the medication we take for depression is actually suicidal thoughts. It doesn't make any sense. You know, you're taking these drugs not to become suicidal, but one of the side effects is suicide. So what needs to be done is very gradually, with lots of support, slowly weaning off the drugs. And when I say slowly, it may take you 6 months or even a year to get off. That's fine, as long as you get off in the end. Often people just want to come off in a few weeks. It doesn't work that way, because it actually alters your brain chemistry. The more drugs you have, whether they're prescripted or illegal, it changes your brain chemistry. So in order to get back to normal, you have to really do it very, very slowly. But so long as you have lots of talking therapy, and I would hope a bit of emotional and spiritual therapy too. Yes, who's next? Yes.
Over.
You talked about depression being the way that people think, and in the beginning of the program, you showed our brain cells.
Yes.
What is the link between the depression and maybe a possible neurological misfire of the brain?
Yeah, so the link between depression and a misfire of the brain. No, I mean, we don't have that evidence. Depression, you see, this is what we do as scientists. We look at people's brains and we say, oh, this person is depressed. When they die, we open up their brains and say, well, do we see anything different? Maybe that's the cause of depression. I often think that as scientists and as doctors, we get it completely the wrong way around. Let me give you an example. Have you ever been to London? Or if you've not been to London, you may have seen these black taxis in London. So these black taxi drivers, they have to study for 3 years every single route in London. So that's why when you get into the cab and you say, oh, I want to go to Soho Square, they know exactly how to get there. No sat-nav, they know exactly how to get there. They have to study for 3 years. Now, what we found is that when these black cab drivers die and we open up their brains, there's a certain part of their brain that is highly developed. It's common to black cab drivers. Now, nobody would suggest that because they've got a strange part of their brain, that led them to become a black cab driver. No, it's what they have studied has changed their brain. That's the way round it goes. And, you know, we all know this in the Bible. By beholding, we become changed. So even though you can find in a depressed person certain areas of the brain that look different, it didn't start there. It started by what we behold. It started by how we think about ourselves, about everybody else. That has a dramatic and physical impact on our brains. So it's that way around. Rather than the misfiring causing the depression, it's the depression that causes the misfiring. But thank you for that. That's an interesting question. Who has?
Okay,
Yes.
I've got a question. I've got a person that I'm dealing with who's got fibromyalgia, depression, degenerative disc. He's taken drugs, he's taken marijuana on top of it. And his children tell me he sleeps a lot when he does. Like my daughter got him back to working at least 3 days a week. But he does sleep a lot. I don't know how to deal with it. I don't know what to say to him that would maybe help him in different ways.
Yeah. And so here's another thing. Like we said, one of the triggers for depression can be a disease. For some of us, we can have a disease and it's not going to trigger depression. But for some of us, if you have something like fibromyalgia, which makes you very tired and lethargic, and sometimes you feel that there's no hope and you're never going to get better, it can trigger you into depression. Well, the good news is that fibromyalgia is an autoimmune disease. So there are things we can do, and as I said, on that yellow path, the autoimmune part of his illness can be stopped and reversed. Often, if you are dealing with that illness, plus you're giving him some supportive therapy, that can kick you out of the depression. And then you won't have a need for the cannabis, and then you won't be so tired. Yes, so degenerative disc, we can't do anything about that other than take a lot of weight off. Are you talking about the spine? Yeah, that's what everybody always tells me. You can always lose weight from your middle. Yeah, okay, so I'm not doing a personal consultation, but I'm telling you, if you have degenerative disc disease, the one way to relieve it is to get rid of weight around your middle, okay? And we've all got it. You know, I can lose weight. We've all got fat here that we can lose. The more you lose, the less pressure you're putting on your spine. But deal with one thing at a time. You can reverse the autoimmune disease, and that will give you some freedom from the depression too.
I'm just wondering, how would you define anxiety, and then how would you help someone who suffers from that?
Right. So let me say this, because I didn't talk a lot about anxiety. Anxiety and depression are the same thing.
There's one over here, isn't there?
They look different. They have completely the same, it's just a different way. I mean, those of you who like listening to music, it's like different versions of the same tune. Anxiety, where you know what anxiety looks like, has the same root as depression. So if you are trying to overcome anxiety, and for example, if somebody has anxiety attacks, panic attacks, almost certainly there is something in their history that has caused them some trauma. Okay, so it could be actually physical trauma, it could be emotional trauma, or whatever. And what you have to do is really look into their history. I'm talking about people with real anxiety attacks. Look into their history. Have I really dealt with all of those issues? Have I let go of any anger, jealousy, resentment? Once you do that, then you can be free from anxiety. But anxiety and depression are pretty much one and the same. They come from the same root. Yes?
Okay, I'm a little bit hesitant to ask this, but we are given some counsel on that there are certain things that should only be between God and ourselves.
Yes.
Is there, just address that, speak to it a little bit.
You're getting some counsel that there are some things that should only be between God and yourself.
That's right.
Yes, and I think what I said earlier was, when it comes to forgiveness of whatever sin you have, all you need to do is talk to God. But God has given us instruction, especially in that text, James 5:16, that if you now really want to remove this problem in your life, whether it's an addiction or whatever, the way that he's given us to do it is to find somebody that we can trust to talk to, somebody we can trust. Now, I'm never going to say to you that you should get up in front of the church and say everything that is wrong with you. Never. That's never going to work. But there should be one person, even if it's a counselor or a friend, that you can be honest with, open with, that they can hold you accountable to. That's the way God has given us to actually be free and be healed from certain problems. This is actually how Alcoholics Anonymous started. Alcoholics Anonymous is still the best way to get rid of alcoholism. And it starts, anybody, if you've ever been there, maybe you would never admit it if you had, but if you've ever been there, you have to stand up and say, my name's Chidi, I'm an alcoholic. Just by opening those words and by confessing to people, it helps us overcome. And there's still never been a better way to overcome that addiction.
I wanted to ask you if you didn't say anything about bipolar.
Bipolar depression.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever we do for depression, it's the same for bipolar depression. I know bipolar, you get the highs, very highs, and the very lows, absolutely. But the root cause is still the same.
So if you have a bipolar, is there such a thing as never being on a medication?
Yes, there are people who've been cured from bipolar, but you need to get to the root cause of the issue. There's always a root cause. And often I feel, as medics, we tend not to have enough time to dig deep enough to find out what is the cause, what triggered, what set this off. Once you can deal with that, you can be free. But you don't just come off the medication, obviously. Wow. So there's one way over there. Let's see. This gentleman's getting a lot of exercise. Oh, here's another microphone. Have you got another runner? No? Yes, okay. Yes.
You mentioned that cannabis causes schizophrenia.
Yes.
What about cannabis oil that's low in THC?
Yeah, so cannabis oil. So the question is, I've said cannabis, smoking cannabis and taking it in that way causes schizophrenia. What about cannabis oil? No, this is different. Cannabis oil, you may have heard of it, can be used therapeutically for many different diseases. It's a bit like the difference between somebody saying, I take heroin, that's no good for you, but we all take opiates for pain relief. So there's a different, and it's the same origin. So cannabis oil, and by the way, there's lots of research coming out about cannabis oil now in treatment for very serious illnesses, even things like cancer. So cannabis oil is different to smoking cannabis. Okay, one is therapeutic, one is not. Yes.
Have you ever heard of antidepressants causing loss of memory?
Yes, yes.
Okay, because I just heard about that, and I had been on antidepressants and suffering from memory loss. And my doctor, I told him I can't remember the way I used to, and he never said anything to me about it. It wasn't until by accident that I found out.
No, I mean, if you look at the list of side effects for antidepressants, when you open up, one of them is memory loss. Depending on the drug, they can, there are so many side effects for antidepressants. Yes. No. Yes.
You say to take vitamin D3, but if you have arthritis so bad your bones are being dissolved, that means you still should take vitamin D or not?
Oh, definitely. So if your bones are not in great condition, vitamin D is probably the best thing you can do. So vitamin D, and if you're able to put pressure on your bones as well, I mean walk, those things are great for you. Vitamin D, walking, and avoiding lots of dairy and heavy animal proteins will strengthen your bones. So it's completely the opposite of what we were told, that milk and meat makes your bones stronger. They actually leach your bones of calcium and make them much weaker. By the way, do you know who eats the most meat and dairy in the world? Do you know which race of people? Sorry? New Zealand? That's close. Sorry? Yes, the Inuits, the Eskimos. They eat more meat and dairy than anyone on the planet. They have the most brittle bones than anyone on the planet. The people who eat the least meat and dairy, you go to the Bantu tribe in Africa, they don't eat any meat, no dairy, hardly have any hip fractures into their 90s. So the idea that milk and meat strengthens your bones is complete nonsense. Yes. I guess maybe one more after this one. Yes.
Does diet affect depression, and how?
Okay, yes. There's a study done by the University of California, San Francisco, and it showed, this was done by Dean Ornish and his colleagues, and it showed that simply having a plant-based diet, exercising every day, was more powerful than most antidepressants for mild and moderate depression. Simple. Look that one up. Dean Ornish, University of California. Who gets the last one? Yes.
D3, there is a tablet apparently the doctor can prescribe, but it's not the drops. It's a tablet. Is that okay? Or does it have to be drops?
Oh, it doesn't have to be drops. Any way you want to. I take drops because I just think it's just got less.
So if you can get a prescription for 10,000 units in the tablet.
Fabulous.
That's okay.
Fabulous. Well done. Okay, well, thank you very much. Tomorrow is the last of our talks, and what we'll do tomorrow, we're going to go a little bit deeper into this thing about forgiveness, because I've been talking about forgiveness a lot, but how do we do it? Why do we do it? Can we get some help to do it? So we're going to be here same time tomorrow. Obviously, we're going into the tent now. If you have any more questions or you want any DVDs, that's where we're going to be. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Circle of Hope Network, doing life and being church together.